The raid was going well if the unit's radio chatter was anything to go by. Jensen tuned most of it out. It was hard to hear it over the sound of his dual saw chewing merrily through a tree. There wasn't much else to shoot at in his sector, so Jensen fell back on old habits and decided the best way to intimidate the locals was to deforest the general area. Jensen wasn't really a Battle Mech pilot, but it was hard to hire seasoned mech warriors on the salaries Banson Universal Unlimited was offering. He used to pilot a forestry mech though, which meant that Jensen had first-hand experience with half of his raiders' armament. That was enough to get him the gig, but it did mean he lacked a certain killer instinct. Except when it came to trees. If you needed someone to take a pine out by the roots, Jensen was your man. Only there was very little call for an arborist during a semi-piratical raid.
Jensen, get your ass over here. We need fire support.
Ugh. Jensen sighed. He was just about to finish with that ash tree too. Perhaps the raid wasn't going as well as Jensen thought. By the time he arrived at his Lance commander's location, one raider was already down, its internal combustion engine exposed and leaking oil like blood from a fatal wound. The other members of Jensen's Lance were both tanks, a D1 Schmidt and a J. Edgar. Opposing them were a pair of JES-1 missile carriers and two Pegasus hover tanks, their missile racks still off-gassing exhaust from the apparent ambush that took out the other raider. The D1 brought respectable firepower to Banson's raiders, but it wasn't armored enough to stand up to the wall of missiles the Shiloh militia's hover tanks could launch with every volley. It was rapidly reversing course and firing away with its rotary autocannons while the J. Edgar sped up for a fast retreat. For a moment, Jensen just stood and watched as the D1's autocannons finally chewed away enough armor from a JES-1 to rip through its skirt, sending the hovercraft's nose into the dirt just as it was launching its second volley. The explosions were enough to detonate the missiles that were still waiting to be launched, causing the entire tank to erupt in a brilliant orange fireball. It was an awesome sight, but one that Jensen couldn't appreciate for long. The remaining tanks volleyed missiles into the D1, ripping off armor and deflating two tires, slowing its retreat to a crawl.
Jensen, what are you doing? Stop gawking and fire already!
Right, he had his own missile racks to fire, although he could count the number of times he'd pulled the trigger on one hand. Jensen preferred to engage with his dual saw, not only because of his arboreal history, but because the Raiders' fire control, the Banson-designed AccuTrack 3000, was little more than a floating crosshair on his HUD. Lining the crosshair up with the undamaged JES-1, Jensen pulled the trigger and a swarm of 20 medium-range missiles erupted from his shoulder. Although visually impressive, only 4 warheads actually struck their target. It was enough to get the militia's attention, however. A Battle Mech, even one with exhaust pipes and piloted by a former arborist, commanded respect, which was why the next volley was aimed directly at Jensen's mech. As far as former logger mech pilots go, Jensen was one of the best. Being able to rip a tree from the ground by its roots with the help of 50 tons, however, wasn't enough to stand up to the impact of 50 short-range missiles. Each individual explosion was something the Raider could easily weather, but 50 was like getting hit by a train. Fire erupted across Jensen's view screen, and he immediately fell over backward. The impact cracked his neural helmet, shattering his view screen, and split the housing of his internal combustion engine, causing cylinders to misfire. The white smoke of rocket motors mixed with the black belch from the Raider's engine, consuming itself with each revolution before finally ceasing with a metal screech. As the Raider's cockpit went dark, Jensen idly wondered if perhaps he would have been better off harvesting trees. The early 3100s were an unprecedented era of disarmament within the core of human space. The Republic of the Spear had created a political and legal environment that encouraged the major powers to reduce their overall fighting forces and to curtail new defense spending. Jacob Banson, president and CEO of Banson Universal Unlimited, saw this era of disarmament as a business opportunity to take assets by force rather than by free market. A better term for this strategy is piracy. Banson's plan was to create a private military under the guise of a mercenary company affiliated with his business, Banson Universal Unlimited. Banson insisted on his force including battle mechs, as they'd long been considered the pinnacle of military hardware. But Republic restrictions on such hardware prevented Banson from simply purchasing battle mechs on the open market. Instead, Banson floated the idea of creating an entirely new battle mech designed and built completely in-house. The project, codenamed Jacob's Ladder, began in 3132, with all researchers and engineers working in total secrecy. The project was surprisingly successful. Within 2 years, the team had developed a 50-ton chassis, armor, communications, and targeting equipment for a battle mech that would have been considered state-of-the-art at the turn of the millennium. To arm the mech, Banson Universal acquired Hatchet Dower so they could use that company's MRM-10 launchers, and researchers had even developed a patent for a rotary autocannon. Unfortunately, Banson's researchers had difficulty cracking the secrets of miniaturized fusion that allowed battle mechs to operate for extended periods while discharging directed energy weapons. One such engine test resulted in the death of a lead scientist, causing the project team to abandon fusion power in 3133. The Raiders' power would instead be generated by something much, much older: internal combustion. Although simple and reliable, provided adequate fuel could be sourced, internal combustion engines couldn't provide enough power for lasers or particle cannons, and also prevented the installation of jump jets, although Banson would later develop a jump pack that would give the Raider a limited jump capacity. It did, however, provide enough energy for the full articulation of Myomer bundles, a relatively large missile launcher, and a rather brutal weapon more often associated with the construction industry. Best of all, it made the Raider much cheaper than a true battle mech. The JL-1 Raider first rolled off assembly lines on Tybalt and St. Andre in 3134. At 50 tons, the Raider was powered by a 200-rated internal combustion engine, had 2 single heat sinks, a pair of MRM-10 racks, and a dual saw replacing the left hand. The dual saw was a curious choice, given that mech-sized melee weapons were a known quantity and offered better damage with lower weight requirements. The MRM-10 is also strange as a primary weapon, given its notorious inaccuracy, made only worse by the Raider's first-generation targeting equipment. One point in favor of the Raider was its triple-strength Myomer, a technology that allowed the Raider to achieve speeds of 86 kilometers per hour, with the Raider's combustion engine being liquid-cooled, however. Its TSM system could only be activated with repeated weapons fire or deliberate deactivation of its 2 single heat sinks, a dangerous proposition for inexperienced pilots. 7 tons of standard armor was considered adequate, given the opponents the Raider was expected to face, and the fact Banson couldn't legally source ferrofibrous armor. Initial deliveries of the Raider were given almost entirely to Banson's Raiders, the appropriately named mercenary unit that would often be engaged in extra-legal acquisition following the collapse of the HPG network. With survivors unable to report raids until weeks or sometimes months after the fact, Banson operated with near impunity and even began to sell Raiders to cash-strapped mercenary units of questionable honor, some of which may have had similar piratical tendencies. The Raider was best used in mass waves, overwhelming defender with sheer numbers, and closing to short range where it could most effectively use its missiles and dual saw. The JL-2 Raider Mark II gave the mech a long-range option by swapping the MRM-10s with a rotary autocannon. Fitting the Rack II required downsizing the engine, giving the Mark II a top speed of 64 kilometers per hour with its TSM activated. 10 tons of standard armor at least allowed the Mark II to better endure return fire. Banson hailed the Raider as a complete success, offering BattleMech-sized firepower at a fraction of the cost of a real BattleMech. But success as the leader of a pirate band required more than business savvy. The first Banson's Raiders, also known as the Scourge, mutinied on Tybalt in 3136, capturing Jacob Banson before handing him over to Republic authorities to be brought up on various arms violations. Banson's Raiders would then disband, although the Raider would continue to be built by former Republic factions, seeking to rapidly rearm during the Dark Age. In fact, multiple Raider variants would arise as local industries took advantage of Banson's Universal's lack of leadership, all of which would do away with the cumbersome dual saw and inaccurate MRM-10s. Perhaps the best of them all was the JL-3B, which added power packs to enable the use of an all-energy weapon armament, including a light PPC, 2 medium lasers, 1 extended range small laser, and a standard small laser. Double heat sinks, improved cooling, and a retractable blade replaced the inefficient dual saw. The widespread and illegal construction of the patented design would continue unabated until Simcox Industrials acquired the rights after Banson's Universal's dissolution in 3149. Wildly outclassed by nearly every medium BattleMech produced since 3025, Simcox still sells the Raider to smaller planetary garrisons, down on their luck mercenaries, and paramilitary groups of dubious repute.